I always say that the second coming is the key motivator of the New Testament church. It's something that we see again and again as we look at the New Testament. How the believers are encouraged and constantly being reminded to be encouraged by the fact that Jesus Christ is going to come back, that he's going to come again. And what's clear from this passage we've had this afternoon from 2 Thessalonians is that some people were going to believers and were telling them wrongly that this second coming of Jesus Christ had already happened, that he'd come. And actually, that's not as far-fetched to imagine people would be saying that as sometimes we think. There are a number of organisations these days who would claim that Jesus Christ has already come back. One example would be the Jehovah's Witnesses. I understand that they first predicted that Jesus will be coming back in 1874. But when he didn't come back in 1874, they said, but he's coming back on the 1st of October 1914. When he didn't come back on the 1st of October 1914, they thought again and they came back with the argument, actually he did, but he came back invisibly. So nobody saw him. And what the effect of that is, I believe their teaching is, that he sort of came back invisibly so that he could move from an ordinary seat in heaven to his throne in heaven, and so the teaching goes on. And what we've got in this passage is that similar sort of argument. People are saying to believers, this thing you're hoping in, this second coming of Christ, it's already happened. Now, if you remember when we were looking a few weeks ago at 1 Thessalonians, there was the problem that some people were telling the believers in Thessalonica then that there wouldn't be a second coming, that there's therefore going to be no resurrection, and therefore there's no hope for these people to look forward to, for these believers to be focusing on and hoping for in all of their difficulties. What actually both those arguments are, and particularly the one we're looking at today, that Jesus has already come, was to the believers in Thessalonica an intellectual challenge to their faith. If we think about the believers in Thessalonica, they were actually very good at coping with physical challenge. They were a church that was facing hardship and doing well. That was a physical thing. They were a church that was facing persecution at times, and they were doing well. That was a physical thing. This is an intellectual challenge, though. It was a challenge that was taking away their hope. It was causing them to doubt this thing that they're looking forward to. Is it real? Or it's people saying that it's happened, but really you've not noticed it. It can't be as substantial as you were looking forward to. And what Paul is doing in this passage is correcting that. And what he's saying is, look, it cannot have happened, because if it had, you would not have missed it. And basically he's saying the reason for that is two things will happen first. One is there will be this great rebellion against God, and secondly, tied into that, there will be the arrival of this character described here as the man of lawlessness, referred to elsewhere in the New Testament as the Antichrist, the one who was going to come, the one who was going to oppose all law, both civil law and moral law, the one who was going to set himself up against God, challenging God, taking his position and demanding to be worshipped. Paul's saying this will happen first. Now, it's quite interesting to see how the church overall has handled that down the centuries. Because, of course, once we're assured that this one is going to come before Christ's return, of course the church is going to start speculating. Who is this one who's coming? The example started very early. Early Christians just assumed, well, it's the Roman Emperor, isn't it? Because the Roman Empire was a godless institution that was challenging the faith. And particularly when they got to the point in around AD 80-81, where the Emperor Domitian, he was saying that he must be worshipped as emperor. So you could see why the church were thinking, is it the Roman Emperor who is this Antichrist, this evil one who's going to oppose all godliness and all law and was coming? Of course, that all ended with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine to the Christian faith and the conversion of the Roman Empire subsequently to the Christian faith. And after that, well, who else? Well, shortly after that time, you've got the Vandals invading the Roman Empire from the north. So could it have been any of these Vandal leaders who were coming in and actually did eventually overrun Rome and were very hostile to the Christian faith? They thought, could this be the coming of the Antichrist? In the Middle of Ages, the emphasis shifted. Some Franciscan monks were looking at the popes and thinking, hang on, what we see in Scripture is not what we're seeing in some of these popes. I wonder if they're the Antichrist. And that was picked up by the Reformers, of course. And just to correct the balance, well, some of the popes wondered if the Reformers were actually challenging the law. Were they the Antichrists? The last 250 years, with the moving away from religious states to more secular states, the focus has shifted to political leaders. So within Europe, we've had churches questioning, was it Napoleon Bonaparte? Or as time moved on, what about Kaiser Wilhelm? Or what about Adolf Hitler? Or Joseph Stalin? And let's face it, all of these characters demonstrated a great deal of godlessness, challenging the Christian faith, challenging morality, challenging what was right, and setting themselves up as something greater than they were. But they weren't the one. None of those, though they keep coming, none of those were the one. Bad though some of these characters were, we know that they were not the one, because what Paul is saying here is when this evil one comes, the arrival of this evil one will immediately precede the coming of Christ. So what should we as believers make of this today? It would actually be very easy for us to conclude, that there are going to be times of great evil, and those times of great evil will come and go, like they have throughout all of history. Therefore, there will always be many characteristics of the Antichrist coming and going, and that will be it. But actually, the Scripture speaks far too much and far too often about the coming of this evil one for us to dismiss it in that way. But what we do have always with it is this accompanying promise, the assurance that when this evil one comes, which will be greater than any evil we've seen in the past, then Christ will return. Now, just to say, when this passage talks about the lawless one setting himself up in the temple, it's very interesting to look and see how Jesus handled that sort of argument. Probably the clearest passage where Jesus is talking about these things himself is Matthew 24. In verses 15 and 16 of that passage, is Jesus speaking, he says, "The day is coming when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, the sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing in the holy place. Then those in Judah must flee to the hills." And he goes on giving dire warnings. What was Jesus talking about? Well, people who look at these things tend to suggest that maybe, well, certainly in AD 40, the Emperor Gaius Caligula wanted to have a statue of himself put up in the Temple of Jerusalem. And there are many people who believe that in part, maybe Jesus was talking about that act. Actually, he never did it because he was assassinated in AD 41. And then we could look and say, well, in part, Jesus was probably talking about or predicting the great challenge to the early believers in AD 70, where the temple in Jerusalem was overrun and sacked by the Romans. Clearly dreadful times. And there's no doubt that part of what Jesus was saying in Matthew 24 was just sort of saying about these immediate bad times that were coming. But then if we look on in Matthew 24 and read on, he says, in verses 29-31, immediately after the anguish of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give no light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then at last, the sign of the Son of Man is coming will appear in the heavens, and there will be deep mourning among all peoples on the earth. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with the mighty blast of the trumpet, and they will gather his chosen ones from all over the world, from the farthest ends of the earth and heaven. When Jesus spoke about this, he too was talking about two things. He was talking about hard times coming immediately, and he was also talking about this greater time which clearly nobody could ever miss. He was talking about his return. And what we see in our passage from Paul to the church in Thessalonica, in verses 6 and 7, is that this final rebellion is being held back. It's being held back. What Paul doesn't tell us is what or who is holding this rebellion back. How is it being held back? I would suggest probably the simplest explanation of the how is the most likely. Lawlessness is being held back by law. Law holds back lawlessness. You know, the existence of law is a good thing. Lawlessness will break through wherever there is no law or where the law is thin. And we've only got to watch the news and look around the world and to see where that is happening. When law is weak and thin, lawlessness breaks through. Where law collapses and there is no law, then there are dreadful happenings, as all of us have seen over the years as we've seen reports coming in from different parts of the world. And therefore we have to conclude that law is good. And actually it's interesting that Paul often, for example in Romans 13, teaches the church to be obedient to law and to those in authority because it is good. And actually Paul himself, if we read through the book of Acts, is a number of times protected from worse treatment because of the law. He declares that he's a Roman citizen, and that gives him protection, the protection of the law. That means he's not as adversely treated as he would have been. And of course, it's because of the law and the position that he gives him that he was able to appeal to Caesar and consequently go to Rome, which had a big impact on his life and his work and much of the New Testament that we've got. So what is holding back the evil one? In a sense, it's the law. We've got to recognise law is good. And yet the spirit of Antichrist, of the evil one, is at work. And that's what we see, and it helps us to understand the world in which we're in. God's using law to hold back the evil one. But this current ongoing situation of evil breaking through and then being restrained and then being held back will not continue forever. There will come a time when things are getting worse and worse, where the evil one breaks through. And actually, what is the encouragement for the church is when that time comes, it immediately precedes the second coming of Christ. So what Paul is doing in this passage is encouraging the church. Encouraging the church in Thessalonica not to be deceived, not to be discouraged by what other people say, but actually to understand the reality. Yes, we will, all of us, experience and see in the world evil breaking through. That is being constrained, and we can see it by law. So when we see things going wrong in the world, we can be glad that there's a constraining element, the law. We've all seen this, where things have gone wrong, and yet law has been re-established, and life moves on, and we're glad of that. But those times are hard. But at least we understand it and what's happening. And then, even when things go ultimately bad, at the end, the Christian believer's got hope. Because when law is finally removed and lawlessness prevails, that's the moment that Christ will return. If we think about it, this passage, yes, not easy to understand at face value, but it really is an encouragement to all believers throughout all time, no matter what circumstances we might face within our lives. The key motivation of the New Testament church always was, and still should be, the hope that Christ will return.